Close that. All right, so Adi and Marty, glad to have you here. I think you're both new to the dialogues, am I correct?
I've been to one already.
Okay.
I also did one about a year ago.
This is how bad my memory is because I'm old, so we'll go with that. But we are live streaming, so we can get started. I want to thank everyone for being here today. This is a popular culture dialogue from the Popular Culture Studies Journal. And today we're going to be talking about history in popular culture. As we do, I'm going to start us off by having each person introduce themselves and what brings them here today. So I'm going to start just kind of going around the U shape that's on my screen and start over with Cait.
Hi, I am Cait Coker. I'm a professor and curator of rare books and manuscripts at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My specializations are in the early modern book world, but also the history of women in labor, and also popular culture.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cait. Going down below me now to the first I see is Marty.
Hey, everybody. My name is Marty. I am a PhD student at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I study largely at this point more representations of disability and masculinity and disability. But in my master's and kind of on the side still, I have done quite a bit of work on the representations of queerness in historical fiction. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marty. And going next to Marty, we have Adi.
Hi, I'm Adi. I work for both the Tel Aviv University and the Key Impact Institute for Public Policy. And I study identity politics and political communication. And in recent years, I've worked on both LGBT representation, representation of the feminist early struggles of especially the 19th century, and very recently, minorities in Israel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I apologize, my managing editor, multimedia editor just alerted me to that there was someone waiting in the waiting room I forgot to invite. So Catherine, we'll have you introduce yourself last to help you get oriented. So we'll go up to Princess next.
I am Princess O'Nika Auguste from St. Lucia. I have degrees in Lit, History and Religion, and my area is gender, sexuality, and how they intersect with, and violence, and how they intersect with pop culture and history and religion. And that's what I'll be focusing on. And also ethnicity.
Great, thank you, Princess. And Catherine, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and what brings you here today.
Hi, my name is Catherine Rockwood. I'm an independent scholar and poet and a, critic. I review books and TV for Strange Horizons fairly regularly. And I think what brings me here today is that I got really obsessed with Our Flag Means Death. And also, so I have a PhD in Renaissance studies, so where I studied the way that we interpret plays in the late Caroline era, relating to things like the start is immediately pre-English Civil Wars, and so it was kind of a history and lit approach. But so I'm here because I yell a lot about Our Flag Means Death and history, and that's my story.
Wonderful, glad to have you here, and thank you all for coming in today as we end March of this year. The reason why I wanted to talk about this is my partner, Chris Olson, has in the past talked about the queering of history in popular culture and mass media, and how the way that historical facts and events and individuals are presented can alter then how we think about history. And I found that idea very fascinating. So I kind of just wanted to maybe use as a foundation for this conversation, let's start by talking about, well, just how is history represented in popular culture? What are your takes on, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, which history in some ways? How does popular culture inform, tell us, what is it telling us about history? And I'm going to let who'd ever like to start go for it.
I think recent popular culture is starting to do a really good job of showing the diversity of historical periods. I'll give an example of Bridgerton, even though that it's not historically accurate, it does show the diversity of Georgian, or the I call it the Regency era. There was a Black upper class and different forms of different ethnicities living in Great Britain at the time. And also the Gilded Age also shows the Black upper class and recent and racism in that, what was going on in that era. So recent pop culture is starting to do a better job of it, but the early pop culture didn't. There was hardly any Black and other people of color in pop culture, in film and movies and television.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback on that quick, you think about HBO's Watchmen, Lovecraft Country, and the ways in which they're handling Emmett Till or the Tulsa Massacre and conveying all of that. But even I think of ABC's version of Ghost from the BBC has a woman from the jazz era who's African-American, and having that representation and remembering the immense importance of African-Americans' contributions and creation of the jazz era, I think is an indication that we're seeing potentially better representation coming in at this point.
We are. I mean, talking about Lovecraft Country a little bit, I would say that there's been some discussion of the costs as well, in terms of, you know, representing extremely painful national histories and legacies, and sort of, again, what in particular what kind of a burden that can be for the people who are called upon to represent it. And it's a very difficult, so I think about one of the things I'm most interested in about Our Flag Means Death is, you know, sort of what that show, which is, you know, has a very diverse cast and, you know, is clearly committed to diversity in casting, how it is negotiating its relationship with the legacies of colonialism in the Caribbean and on the North Atlantic coast in the time period that it sort of claims to be part of. And that's another question, right? How far do you trust a show that's a comedy and is sort of trying to kick out some of the really hard historical content, you know, kind of to sort of, you know, make it stand at a distance from what it's representing on the screen. You know, so how do these shows balance the pain and the cost, right, against their own generic, you know, constraints and against what they hope to do for the popular viewer, you know, in what do they hope to teach?
And profit, of course.
And profit, I mean, always. Yes.
Yeah.
I think if I were to put a headline on that, I would say that I think there's a process of increasingly putting the pop or the populace back in to pop culture history representation. We are seeing a surge of more and more, like even royal show, even The Crown, for example, shows us real people and the more mundane part of the great historic events. but more so movies and series focus more on ordinary life more than they used to. If in the up until the 60s, we've always seen just the great big stories and always generals and queens. Now, even the queens are like normal people. If I think of like The Empress, for example, on Netflix, about Princess Elizabeth or Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, the German show on Netflix, but also just a lot more regular people. Wars are seen not from the eyes of the generals, but from the eyes of the simple soldier, which used to be like very radical in the 80s and 90s, and is now just the common thing to do. So I think it's becoming more popular in the sense that it's history itself is described more and more this way, like in our rooms in academia, history is becoming more, okay, so this was daily life for Spartans or for people of the Victorian era. And TV is reflecting this to us and showing us how a simple woman would live in, I don't know, Ireland in the 18th century. So I think the popular culture is bringing the pop back into history, into our view of it.
I want to piggyback on that a little bit, because while there is this greater representation of like the people of lower classes and so forth, sometimes there's also an incredible projection of what writers on TV or in books think the life of women was like in previous centuries as opposed to in reality. What's really the example that's really coming to mind here is the one too of Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, and the TV show, but also the later TV show Sleepy Hollow, both of which involve 18th century witchcraft plots. The Outlander one is a little bit less egregious because early 18th century in the rural parts of Britain, you would see that it was something that happened on occasion, was very rare, but it was a thing. In Sleepy Hollow, they had one of the historical characters burned at the stake in colonial America in like the 1760s or 80s or something, and it's like, no, American witches were hanged and pressed; they were never burned. But also like this notion of if you were an intelligent woman in the past, quickly straight to the stake with you, the end. And the more complex reality is that, of course, women of different stations had many, many more options aside from a sad life and then dying in childbirth or whatever. If you look at the history of guild crafters and so forth and the different guilds, you see women as like professionals in their fields going back to the 12th and 13th centuries. And so this kind of displacement of the possibilities of women in fiction that is then received as fact by audiences, it's really messy and it makes me incredibly uneasy.
Yeah, I think this is a question about how well do these shows do, right? How, and to what degree does writing for television fall prey to cliches that could be avoided again by, closer historical study, basically, a wider understanding of what the options might be that might make plots more complex. So that, what do we still use shorthand for and settle for reductive versions of when we're dealing with representations of, history in our television?
Yeah, something that I think is really interesting to me is this tension between genre and perceived authenticity. Like the concept of authenticity itself is so interesting. One example that I really love is called the Tiffany problem. The idea that like the name Tiffany is like,
that's right,
has like a long history, right? But if you put a character named Tiffany in historical fiction, modern audiences are going to say, and assume it's anachronistic. And so there's this kind of pressure, I feel, that even shows that are attempting to do authentic work, as opposed to leaning fully into anachronisms like Rain, like, you know, they are in some ways bound by what they think audiences think is real. And I think that is very interesting. And that's something that I've explored a lot with representations of queerness, and how assumptions that history was always very unkind to queer people means that a lot of times in historical fiction, if we're attempting to be authentic, we just are torturing these poor characters. And, you know, I think, and genre itself is really interesting as like where these boundaries are of, you know, how much we can kind of get away with things and what makes it into the shorthand. Like Adi was saying, the examples of Sparta and I think like women in the 18th century, maybe. And I was thinking before we got here about like notable SNL skits, and like the SNL skit of Sparta and the SNL skit of like the lesbian period drama, where these kind of tropes have become so much a part of pop culture that we can kind of tap into them even on like SNL, this very broad format that is like based in humor. We all have to kind of get the root of the joke for it to play. So anyway.
To piggyback on the whole how pop culture doesn't really try to be accurate, it goes with not only women, but with people of color, Black people, because a lot of the portrayals of Black people is either during slavery or after slavery, and then the whole thing is during the Jim Crow area, if in the case of the Gilded Age, Jim Crow areas, 1920s, 1940s. So the audience don't know that there were Black people that weren't slaves or enslaved. For Bridgerton, there was a lot of backlash for Bridgerton because they showed a lot of people of color, Black people and other people of color in high positions. And we have Queen Charlotte being Black, the depiction of Queen Charlotte. There are rumors going on. Most historians say she wasn't part Black, but there are rumors of her being mixed. So the audience are pushing against that, saying that why are all these Black people or Indian people in British upper class? Are they not supposed to be in India or be enslaved or working for jobs? But in fact, there were Black people in the upper class.
Adi?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that I think a development that we've seen in recent years is in how we talk about pop culture, because in early days of internet, like late 90s, early noughties, people would argue a lot and nitpick a lot on the dresses. And this cleavage is all wrong. And a lot of the nitpicking was, okay, there is no way this sword could be forged in this era. And in recent years, we see the debate going more into the social issues. And I think it shows a development of the conversation we have about history. And I think it's almost a cliche to say that the history that we see on TV reflects the contemporary issues we deal with. And I think the fact that the conversation has grown up to understand that this is something that is done. People are no longer innocent watchers of TV. We're critical to it, and I think that this development it's progress, but progress not like in a derogatory way. I see progress as a positive thing here.
Well, and it's progress that, as Princess was pointing out, is being met with a lot of pushback. And here in the United States, we've got, you know, various conservative governments right now trying to squelch what history is being taught in schools, potentially because of it reflecting an understanding of history that doesn't align with a more positive understanding of the United States. And I think that's demonstrating, you know, we do have this tension, but I like that idea too of how we see history through our contemporary lens. Because that then brings up a question I wanted to ask is this a new phenomenon, or do you think that we've always kind of looked at history through what might be a popular perspective at the time that we look at the history? Because in a way, popular culture is about that popular perspective. And is that something new to this point in time, or is perhaps that something we've done throughout our understanding of and use of history in our lives?
No, look at Shakespeare plays.
Yeah, I was also going to offer an early modern, some anecdotes, and just say that, you know, in my all too obsessive study of the late plays of Ben Jonson, I mean, one of the things that kept cropping up was Jonson and Jonson's characters as basically archaeologists of their own material culture. And so that, you know, in a Ben Jonson play, you might find a particular character's outdated perspective on contemporary courtship being indicated by his possession of a dated sword. You know, I mean, like that this person, oh, well, he has, you know, this enormous two-handed, you know, sword that he keeps in his attic, which is from the time of Elizabeth. And this is the time of James. And so, you know, that's one way that you can identify somebody not having quite the right take on the very contemporary sort of courtship issues that are being discussed at the time. And also so in coins, people were interested in coins in Jonson's plays, and it would be like, you know, and you could tell how acute they were as observers based on their understanding of their own material culture and its periods. Anyway, that's what I can offer.
I think so. I think what I was saying is how it's become popular to be reflective of this fact. I mean, the fact that history is always a contemporary issue. I think of how Renaissance sculpture and public buildings had always been looking at contemporary, looking at history, at Greek and Roman history, contemporary issue. I remember being in one of the British palaces and in Hampton Court, and they had like tapestries of Alexander the Great, and the current king, I think it was one of the 18th century kings, was portrayed as Alexander the Great. So they had like historic pop culture, and they knew they were doing it to address contemporary issues. I think what the difference between past portrayals of history and current, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the popular understanding of that this is how we deal with history, and history is always interacting with contemporary issues. The fact that it is a popular understanding is something new. That it's no longer just a tool within the hands of hegemony to tell these stories and say, yes, this is history, and the masses understand it as it is a history lesson. But it's becoming more and more popular, the notion that history is used as a tool of, I can say propaganda, but I also mean of a learning, a way to teach the public. And breaking tropes is one way that it's done. In Israel nowadays, we consume a lot of British and American media, I think more than anything than other sources. And there was the public television had a series about the time that the British had ruled this area of Palestine, and sudden Israelis heard on TV British accent as the bad guys. It was like people reacted to it funny because they are used to having a British accent as the detective, the commander, the great saviors of World War II. And all of a sudden, British accent are the people who are locking people up and locking Holocaust survivors in camps in Africa. And people were surprised by breaking of this trope. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that the meta understanding of how history is used, and we know tropes, we recognize them, and we recognize when they're broken, it means that like our conscience as public is growing. Consciousness, sorry.
I kind of want to squish those two ideas together, because one of the things that I was kind of thinking about with Shakespeare plays is, you know, the ways that he used history. And obviously there were elements that were always for the popular audience, and there were always the ones that were commissioned from higher above, shall we say. And what I was thinking in particular is, of course, Richard III and the apocryphal account of, you know, when a performance of Richard III is being used by the Earl of Essex as a kind of revolutionary thing that involves lots of people going after. But the apocryphal account of Elizabeth's response is, "I am Richard, know ye not that." Like, she's seeing herself in this fictional portrayal of this dissolute monarch with bad things happening, and the effect that is having politically all around her. I kind of want to compare that going back to the Outlander TV series, which is the first couple seasons revolve around the Jacobite the revolutions of the early 18th century, attempts from Scotland to separate itself from England. It goes poorly. And what was really striking to me back in early 2016 when season 2, which is about the 45 rebellion, the airing of it in the UK was postponed until after the then current referendum for Scottish independence, because it was feared that too many people would be watching this TV show about these bad English people and the abuses against the innocent Scots and so forth, and that would push them further towards voting for that separation referendum. I think that's fascinating. And Catherine Scott notes in chat she's worried about performance of Richard II, not Richard III. I get them confused sometimes. Numbers are confusing.
I think it's the fact that Richard II was deposed, whereas Richard III was defeated in battle, and so that I think that's. And again, Essex was clearly willing to cause trouble, but I think it was the second.
Yeah, my brain always focuses on Richard III because I have that focus on disability. And so I think the way that disability is represented in that play is like a fascinating idea of like this propaganda, and how then it's adapted by every new performance of that show is a really interesting study in like how disability is being presented by like contemporary people for a contemporary audience. And is it physical? Is it mental? Like, is it, shown? Is it implied? I think that's a really fascinating rabbit hole to go down, but potentially
Richard III is also just such a raging fire of a play. I mean, it's just so like it's so exciting. Richard II is slower.
Yeah, and the Richard III, when you try and like look at it with the relationship with obviously like Anne and his wife, and the history of like how well they knew each other, and then you watch the play and it's like, oh, and then he just like met her at the grave. Like, what? Anyway, I could go down the hole on that one.
I never read Richard the Third. Is he the one that they say killed the princess in the tower?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I never watched it, because I was like, I'm not going to be reading anybody about killing little children in the Tower of England.
But so to bring it interestingly back to maybe contemporary times, isn't he also the one whose body wasn't found until recently?
Yes,
And now
yes,
there's a movie
yes,
about
yes.
that.
yes.
In a car park in Leicester.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
she was inspired, according to the popular culture of the past, to go and find him. So that's this weird circling then about how history and popular culture have this relationship with one another.
That is
And
an
then that comes
interesting
back further
subgenre.
around because, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's like an interesting new subgenre, right? Of like Outlander has a spin-off of like, let's go look at Scotland. And when Merlin was happening, they had the actors from Merlin go like, let's go look at the history of, Arthurian legends. And that kind of having actors of historical fiction, if you consider Merlin historical fiction, to like kind of go back and unpeel the like history in kind of a documentary format is but you're watching these actors then like go through the education process and that's similar to the like do you know who you are TV shows where it's like these actors kind of peeling back their personal histories. And I just imagine how tickled the historians are to get to be like, guys, look at this research that I've spent my life doing and now it's on television for the masses. But that's an interesting subgenre that's popped up too.
Yeah, I think this returns to, again, there's kind of an issue of like the real presence, right, of history. And sort of, like how, do we need relics? Do we actually, there's, do we actually have to go there, once our imagination is engaged by it? And what kind of, like, how should the energy that is produced by having popular audiences watch historically based or tangentially historically based serial fictions, how should that energy be directed most productively, right? Especially by the people who have engaged all this interest around the show. And so the kind of the attractive quality of the actors going to these places where they've like played historical figures, that the attention is still on them. Like, how should that be used? And I guess as somebody who really believes in the power of fiction and just like as a total like fiction fanatic, I mean, it does frustrate me a bit, to honestly to see these kind of the real presence of the history of the show, turned into these travelogues sometimes. Depending on, again, it depends, but. Can't we also just like read and think and,
I think it's a bit of an embarrassing story, but I'll tell it because it's cute. In 2010, I was in New York City, and what I really like to do when I'm anywhere really is to take guided walks through the city. And I went downtown, and at some point I asked the guide, and it was a great guide from the Historic Society of New York, and we laugh at Americans for calling things that are 200 years old historic. And I asked her who was Alexander Hamilton. Now this is 2010, okay? And I'm not a person who has no idea about American history, because I went to a tour on American history in downtown New York, downtown Manhattan, and I wasn't aware who was Hamilton. Now, I don't think that nowadays anyone can get to New York and not know who Hamilton was. And I think we have popular culture to thank for. And I think also when Catherine said that you're a fan of the way these stories can be told, and can't we just read? Well, I didn't read a book about Alexander Hamilton. The year later in university, I read Federalist because it was in the curriculum, and I would have gotten there anyway, but not all people would have gotten there anyway. And I think that nowadays we have a huge discussion in Israel about judicial activism, and knowing some of the historic background of the American system, just because of pop culture, I think is an amazing layer on this public debate. So I think that the fact that popular culture deals with history is sometimes something we can be grateful for. And what Cait said about Outlander and the referendum in Scotland. So the way that we bring up history, I think pop culture is not only to blame for making things superficial, but it's also to thank for like educating the public about and getting people to want to know more, be informed, even with the nitpicks and mistakes they make, informed of history.
Oh, sorry. I was going to piggyback on what Adi and Catherine said, because history is assumed to be boring in schools. There's this stereotype that history is boring. And so we should be grateful and thankful for popular culture because they bring out the movies and the television series, even though they do make mistakes, like Adi was saying, they bring out history in a fun and entertaining way. And so some people, when they see that, they want to go and read up about Catherine of Medici or Queen Charlotte or Mary Queen of Scots. Even though I'm much as I believe that was the best portrayal of Mary Queen of Scots, the show was a little iffy to me, but yeah.
Cait, I know you had something that you wanted to pop in with before.
Oh, I wanted to circle back around so going back to the discovery of Richard III. There's a new film about that's coming out like now called The Lost King that is tremendously controversial because of the way it removes the dozen women academics who were incredibly important in actually seeing those archaeological finds through and examined and identified and so forth. And within the film, they have been shuffled off into the roles of a couple of men, one of whom is totally fictional, and the other of whom is a real life person who's actually about truly considering suing for defamation because of how badly they treat him. And I think that this comes around to this interesting kind of idea of not just how we receive history, but also how we think history is done. And this notion that history is the preserve of stuffy, cranky old white men, when that's not the case anymore. And again, you could get erasure of women's labor and a whole bunch of other things, but this perception of the academy is this stuffy, grumpy obstacle to history rather than the people who are trying to help rediscover it. And given the current fights over tenure and things and what you can even just study in the United States and elsewhere right now, I think it's an interesting tack to take.
It's so interesting because it reminds me of the controversy that was happening around the film Stonewall, where the trailers come out and like the main character is, as far as I recall, like this blonde man, right? This like a completely fictional character, and people were very grumpy, right? Because why are we centering this fictional character over the like real women of color, like trans women of color who should be getting credit if this is education, right? And there's something really interesting, I think, with again, talking about like subgenres, the genre of recent history, like queer history that is for fun, but also very much trying to like teach, I think, the public about LGBT history in the last 100 years, especially things that people remember, right? Like Pose comes out, and I don't want to say Queer as Folk is historical fiction because a little bit like yikes on all of us personally, but for a lot of the younger generation, Queer as Folk is kind of historical fiction, Stonewall and It's a Sin, and all of these things that are being created by people in the LGBT community who want like their stories and their history to be known, potentially just by younger LGBT people, but also I think like have a place in the cultural consciousness. And then, you know, how does that track with I remember these things, right? And who gets to be presented in these stories, and like going back to that theme of education and how this can be like kernel that people come from. Christopher Isherwood, I would never have known about if Christopher and His Kind hadn't come out. Versailles taught me about Philippe Duc d'Orléans, right? Like the brother of Louis XIV. Harvey Milk, honestly, I'm too young for that. I did not know that Harvey Milk existed. And then we have, you know, Alan Turing, and the film about him was very controversial based on how he was represented. And so there are these like really important voices to be presented and stories to be told. And like, honestly, Pose is one of the first stories where I saw predominantly Black and people of color being presented as emblematic of LGBT culture, and not like side characters. But, you know, then who are we centering? Who gets the biopic? All three of those examples, all four of those examples were white men, right? And so it gets messy, but, you know, yeah, when we're making up fake people to tell real stories, you know, what does that allow us to do? And also, how can that be very problematic?
That was going to be one of my questions. I mean, of course, one of the questions, given what you were just saying, Marty, is, I mean, should we be expecting popular culture or artists, creators to be educators? And I think that's an interesting tension to work through. But then when we think about representations of history, is it, I know this is a binary, but is it better or worse for it to be a fictional person in a historical event, or a fictionalized version of a person in an event? Like, do you want to put a person who never existed in the event to show what happened? Or do you want to take just parts of what happened and who the people were and create a fiction and create a story around that? I'm not sure which is better or which is worse in this case.
Yeah, and this is tricky because of the time constraints of the medium, right? I mean, I think about, for instance, Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy. I don't know if, but it's a, you know, if it's a 3-volume work, you know, that centers queer, real people from history, and is able to, you know, kind of, again, do a full rendering of them. But it's not, I mean, again, it took 3 novels, you know, and so it's just different with TV. You know, that's very tricky. I mean, I think about that in relation to Our Flag Means Death, because, you know, Our Flag Means Death is, you know, we could get into a whole thing about whether or not it's historical, you know, but it's also, you know, it is kind of trying to create nominally, you know, sort of queer ancestors, right, or queer elders, you know, sort of based in this sort of nominally 18th century context. And yet it's always like, well, you could just shuffle all of that off if you wanted to, because, you know, it's just a rom-com. It's just, you know, pirates. It's just for fun, you know. And so, like, again, what is the takeaway going to be for people? You know, arguably, this is very much a show that is, you know, it's hugely contemporary. So.
Yeah, I think I tend towards the second side of what you said. I want to see the real characters, even if we're going to have the debate on how Alan Turing was wrongly depicted. I want him depicted because in 2 years later, there was a contest in the new Microsoft headquarters in Israel, and it was still alive in the debate as a character because I think to some extent the pop culture representation, and they named a street after him. So it was a fictional character about a gay man in 20th century England, then we wouldn't get anything of it. And now that there's a street named after him, it was published. He gained recognition. And I think like the movie Hidden Figures about the computer NASA, the fact that they were real women, even if strongly depicted, even if there were some aspects that were comical about the way they were depicted, still they were real women and their real names got recognized. And you know, when pop culture is misrepresenting, we can have the debate about that, and it brings the name into the public debate. So I would prefer the imperfect representation of real people, especially when it comes to queer people and women and people of color and indigenous people, because we want to hear their names. We don't do that enough. Now, I wouldn't take it to extreme. Okay, what Disney done with Pocahontas is too much. Okay, but still, you know, why do my kids know that Pocahontas is a bad historic representation? Because Disney had done it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have known. I would not engage a conversation about the colonial atrocities done to indigenous people in North America. So I think in a way, even if pop culture is not doing a perfect job, and even if it's doing a horrible job in representing real people, I prefer real people. Even if I think how Stonewall would have looked like with trans person of color leading it. Probably not the best representation of trans women of color, but still I want to see that movie.
Yeah, I really like your point about like specifically getting the names and the stories of individuals who maybe are marginalized in or seen as exceptional in their, you know, historical time period. Princess was talking about the backlash to Bridgerton and the idea that you know, there weren't any, you know, Black people of color who would have been in privileged positions in this time period. But then you watch the movie Belle and like, okay, here's one very notable example that you can't pretend didn't exist, right? This is a real historical figure, so you can't say that these people didn't exist. You know, you look at Philippe from Versailles, and this is a person who was very privileged, who was wearing like women's dresses in French court, and he didn't get executed for being queer. He had a public boyfriend, right? Along with many other affairs. But like, he was living very openly as a queer person, and potentially he was, you know, I'm sure that his status as a very privileged person helped him have all the opportunities to live this way. But you can't say there were not queer people in history that were able to live openly, because we know that this person existed. So I think that there is something, like you said, specifically about finding these kind of exceptional examples and bringing them to the fore that is potentially walking that line of being educational, not in the specifics of their case necessarily, but as like emblematic of who this person was, that is very valuable.
I think, though, there's also the flip side to this, because I can go back to Birth of a Nation and thinking about the impact that that movie had on essentially reigniting a lot of the KKK and what would come in the 20th century. And people still, you know, watch it today and get a kick out of it if they're horrible people. So it kind of brings up this thing with history too, is that history is made out of perspectives. History is made out of stories, and stories are highly perspective. They're going to be one person's story, and you get enough of them together, and maybe you get the bigger story of events and whatnot. But then that also means that if we try to tell stories about history in popular culture, given that we also have the constraints of whatever medium it is we're using to tell the story, it's even possibly more constrained perspective. So if we're faced with this tension that people don't necessarily have a good idea of studying history, that they think it's boring and not necessary, and yet we have all of these specific perspectives being presented in popular culture, is that a problem then when people might just be learning about a historical event or person from the popular culture and maybe either don't know or don't have the motivation to then go find, and I can't even say the truth because I don't think that's the right word to use here, but to go learn more, maybe. Is that a problem? And I'm going to kind of throw that out maybe as kind of like the last big question for us to tackle right now.
I think it is a problem in a way because the medium, you don't want to feel a movie. For example, I use the musical Evita. People have this perception of that the movie is what happened. Evita. The musical is, I'll give it like say 50% accurate. But when you talk to people who have seen it, or they use that. They use what they see in the movie to say that's what happened in Argentina at the time. But they don't have the motivation to go and find out more about Evita or Jean Perron in Argentina. So it is a problem, but then I don't see any way that the pop culture can help with that, because you cannot put a bunch of historical references in a movie. You might be able to get away with it in a book or maybe lesser extent a TV series, but who wants to see a whole bunch of historical citations in a movie about historical characters? So it is a problem, but I don't see a way of how to solve it.
Because even if we do have increased education of history, there's no way that you can teach one person all history. So they would still have to be motivated to go seek it out.
Yeah, that's, the concept of historical fiction versus historical education, right? Like history as like stories, like where's that line? Documentary film as educational, history. Okay, still you're choosing what's going to be in there and what sources you're using and how to present that. And it just gets messy, right? Because like you said, not everybody can know everything. And as you were saying, Princess, like you just can't fit that much like detail and all of these references into something. It made me think of what Cait's been talking about, Outlander. Those books are hundreds and hundreds of pages, like 900 pages, some of them easy, right? Some of them more than 1,000. And you'll get whole chapters of like, today we planted the crops. And it's like this author, bless her heart, she's a professor, right? Like she does years and years and years of research. And then it feels sometimes to me like she wants every detail that she learned to end up in the books. So you get just all of this detail that's like world building, right? Of she figured out how the day-to-day lives of people would be, and she wants to represent it all. And that's really great for those of us who want to read all of that. And other people are going to get burned out after 300 pages and like never look back, right? And so I feel like sometimes we were talking earlier about like history is boring. There's this idea that like we got to get our vegetables in there and sneak them in. Like we got to get the education into the fun thing. And, that balance is something that I think is hard to like make hard and fast rules on.
One show, and we probably don't have time to get into this, but one show we haven't talked about at all is Downton Abbey. And and that was a show where again, I felt like this kind of obligation to represent history as exotic and traumatic. really kind of forced a jumping up the shark fairly early in the series. That, right, is it a problem to have people, and again, maybe I'm getting my genre not quite right. So, I mean, this is a period series that's not, there's no claim to sort of historical fidelity, but it's a period series. And so that's a very, very important distinction, period fiction. But in terms of, is it a problem for people to think that they've seen they know the truth now, right? If they've seen a work of, TV or film that claims to be telling the true story, the real story. I mean, well, this might circle back to, propaganda. It's certainly a problem if you disagree with the motives of the people who have made the show or the movie.
I mean, in a sense, all fiction is persuasive. All fiction is
Yes.
an argument in some way. So yeah. Cait, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to just kind of say at the same time, like I do think historians and other informed parties have a responsibility to speak out when we see history and popular culture being misused for propaganda and other purposes. One thing I wanted to bring up was the case of Snowdrop, which is a Korean TV series from 2021 that I believe is still now on the Disney Plus channel, and was very controversial because it centers on college students in 1980s Korea during the student riots during that time period. Within reality, we literally don't know how many people died during this long, tumultuous, dictatorial era. In the TV show, one of the plots that they introduced was the notion of one of the handsome leads is in fact a North Korean agent. And there's all of this star-crossed stuff and blah blah blah. But the historically, the 1980s, when these riots were happening and people were dying, they were saying this was actually an attack by North Korea. So in making the choice to depict this fictionalization of real events in a particular way, it's becoming really messy really quickly. And so there was a public letter signed by dozens and dozens and dozens of Korean and American professors protesting the release of this television show because they felt that this spin that was being taken on this fictionalized rom-com was actually doing real harm to the people who are still kind of living in this aftermath in some way. Like if you lost a relative during that time period, the way you were thinking of this loss is going to be different if it was because of government issues or an attack by a foreign nation, right? Messy. Which is TLDR, public academics and their responsibilities to the public to do our best in troubling times. Yay.
Yeah. Princess, I want to give you the last word on this one. Do you think that we need to be mindful a little bit more on how we are representing popular culture and history and popular culture?
Yes, I do think that we should be mindful, and as Cait said, that academia needs to be more responsible in calling the mistakes and propaganda of historical programs. But at the same time, there has to be a balance between entertainment and presenting history in a fun and entertaining way and portraying the exact historical facts. And Catherine brought up Downton Abbey, and Downton Abbey, seems to be doing that balancing act. For me, I enjoyed it. I watched all 6 seasons and the 2 movies. I'm hoping for another movie, but anyway. it seems to do a balancing act. It's entertaining people, but at the same time, it's not misrepresenting the historical period so bad that it is messy. So I think they're doing a great balance. They did a great balance with the show. And also how they portrayed the servants, the lower class and regular village life at the time period. I find they did a really good job of that.
I feel I should go back and give that one another try, because once they killed off Dan Stevens, I was like, okay, I'm done. So spoiler, sorry if you didn't know that. I want to thank everyone for coming in today. This actually gave me 2 ideas for more dialogues. One on what happens when you're a fan of history and you're watching these types of portrayals. And 2 about fan pilgrimages, because I think one of the interesting things too about historical representations is when you then do that fan pilgrimage and experience the sites, either the actual historical sites or where the portrayal was recorded. So I think that fan pilgrimages would be a great topic. But again, thank you everyone for spending a little bit of this day in March with all of us. And I hope where you are in the world is a pleasant place to be for at least a little bit of time. Bye, everyone.